बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। आज का हमारा एक नया टॉपिक शुरू करते हैं, दैट इज अबाउट क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ प्रोटीन्स। पहले आप लोगों ने पढ़ा है अमीनो एसिड के बारे में। अमीनो एसिड्स वर द बिल्डिंग ब्लॉक ऑफ द प्रोटीन्स। देन वी हैव स्टडीड अबाउट classification of amino acids in terms of essential amino acids, non-essential amino acids, then standard amino acids and non-standard amino acids. Then depending upon their side chains, benzene containing acidic amino acid, basic amino acids, aliphatic chain amino acids, different types of amino acid we have already studied. Basic structural composition of amino acid pada, and then we have studied about structure of proteins, in which we have studied about the primary structure, peptide bonds. Then we have studied about secondary structure, which is alpha helix and beta sheets, and tertiary structure, quaternary structure. We have also studied about the folding of the proteins, and then in the end we have studied about the denaturation of the proteins, temporary denaturation and the permanent denaturation. Now today we will study about the classification of the proteins. Classification of the proteins uh, is broadly divided into proteins are classified into three main groups depending upon various characteristics. First classification of the protein is depending upon structure of the protein. Structural composition पे depend करता है proteins की classification. Second classification is about composition of the proteins. And third classification is based on the function of protein. So we will study about these different classification of the proteins one by one. First one is depending upon the structure, classification which is based upon the structure of the proteins. We have three main subgroups: fibrous proteins, globular proteins, and intermediate proteins. Three main groups हमने structure पे डिपेंड करते हुए डिवाइड किया प्रोटीन्स को: फाइब्रस प्रोटीन्स, ग्लोबुलर प्रोटीन्स, and intermediate proteins. Now we will study about each of them independently. So first one is the fibrous protein. As the name indicate, they are in the shape of long fibers. So they are linear in structure in shape. So fibrous, as the name indicates, they are linear. Then there are certain examples of these fibrous proteins: collagen, myosin, and keratin. These three are the commonest examples of fibrous proteins: collagen, myosin, and keratin. They are insoluble in water. They have long parallel polypeptide chains, which are either twisted upon themselves or twisted upon each other. And they have different functions. Basically, they perform the function of support and function of contraction. Contractile functions and support function are being performed by them. They are usually very strong and tough, providing support to different tissues. The next group is globular proteins. Fibrous protein हमने पढ़ लिया. Then is the globular proteins. Globular proteins, as the name indicate, they are of spherical shape or globular in shape. Their commonest examples are insulin, which is a hormone regulating the glucose levels in the blood. Then it's the hemoglobin, which all of you know, transport oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. Then another enzyme which is DNA polymerase, another enzyme which is RNA polymerase. These are soluble in water. Fibrous they are not soluble in water, and they are having mostly they have enzymatic function. they have antibody role, and they are basically part of different hormones. Then there is the third group, which is intermediate proteins. Intermediate proteins are having an intermediate structure and shape in between fibrous and globular. And the commonest intermediate protein is fibronogen. So we have studied the classification of proteins depending upon their structural composition. First one is the fibrous protein, then is the globular protein, and third number is intermediate protein. Fibrous proteins are linear in shape, globular are spherical in shape, and intermediates are in between fibrous and globular. Then fibrous are insoluble in water, globular are water soluble, and intermediates are having dual character. Then examples we have studied about the fibrous proteins are the collagen, keratin, and myosin. Basically, their function is providing support, protection, and contractile functions. Globular proteins are having enzymatic function, hormonal function, and carrier function. Intermediates are basically they are in between fibrous and globular proteins, and the commonest example is fibrinogen, which plays an important role in the clotting of the blood. Then we have a second classification of the proteins depending upon their composition. So they have divided the proteins depending upon their composition into different groups. First one is the simple proteins, and second group is the conjugate proteins. So we have a classification of proteins depending upon their composition. Proteins are divided into two main groups depending upon their composition: simple proteins and conjugate proteins. Simple proteins में सब आप लोग याद रखें, they are purely composed of amino acids. They don't have any non-protein part. Purely composed of amino acids. There is no non-protein parts, and they are basically the fibrous and globular proteins or simple proteins. Their examples are collagen, insulin, myosin, and keratin. The other group is the conjugate proteins. They are complex proteins. They have protein part as well as non-protein part. Non-protein part could be in the form of metal ions, could be in the form of carbohydrates, lipids, and phosphoric acid and nucleic acid, or in terms of any B complex vitamins. They are more complex in terms of their function as well as structural composition. Their examples are phosphoproteins, glycoproteins, nucleoproteins, chromoproteins, flavoproteins, and metalloproteins. This is a large group having a number of different proteins and having different functions. We study about briefly we study about each of these conjugate proteins. First one is the phosphoproteins. Phosphoprotein is the casein protein of the milk. It contains phosphate as prosthetic group. Prosthetic group means which is the non-protein part. Then other group is the glycoproteins. Glycoproteins, the major non-protein portion is carbohydrates. Example is mucin. Then nucleoproteins, major non-protein portion is that of nucleic acid. They have different functions, nucleoproteins. DNA, RNA are considered to be nucleoproteins, component of the nucleoprotein. Then chromoproteins, they contain, one of the example of chromoprotein is hemoglobin. It contains iron as prosthetic group. Then lipoproteins, which transport lipids, they have different examples. Low density lipoproteins, HDL, which is high density lipoproteins. Then flavoproteins that contains B complex vitamin as a non-protein portion. One of the example is FAD, flavin adenine dinucleotide. Right. Electron transport chain proteins are also example of flavoproteins. Metalloprotein. Metalloproteins contains metal ions. For example, nitrate reductase is an enzyme which contains the metallic portions. They have different enzymatic functions. Then now we come to the last group. Depending upon, we classify the proteins depending on their structure, depending on their composition, and last is classification of proteins depending upon their function. This classification is overlapping that of the composition, depending upon classification of proteins depending upon their composition. जब हमने फॉस्फोप्रोटीन्स पढ़े, मेटालोप्रोटीन्स, उनका फंक्शन भी साथ साथ पढ़े, तो उसकी रेपिटेशन है, ओवरलैपिंग है, एक दफा रिपीट कर देता हूँ दोबारा से. Depending upon classification of proteins, depending upon their function, broadly we have divided proteins into several groups. Structural proteins की आपको एग्जांपल पता है, कोलेजन, myosin. Then we have enzymatic proteins, enzymes in the form of enzyme insulin, pepsin, all the enzymes are protein in nature. Then hormones, one of the example is insulin. Then एक चीज मैं आपको थोड़ा सा मिस्टेक बता दी, insulin is a hormone. It comes under the headings of hormones. Then respiratory pigment. Respiratory pigment is hemoglobin, myoglobin. They are involved in the transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Then transport proteins. Various water insoluble substances such as lipids are being transported by the proteins, which are known as lipoproteins. And other water insoluble substances are transported by other proteins such as albumin, such as transferrin, which transports iron, cytoplasmin, which transports copper. Then we have the contractile proteins, which are helping in the contraction of the muscle. And the commonest example is actin and myosin. Then we have the storage proteins, which keep the storage of various water-insoluble substances. For example, ferritin keeps the store of iron. Then there are certain toxins, whereas toxins are also having protein component. For example, snake venom is having protein components, and protein component is in the form of enzymes, which cause cellular digestion, damage करते हैं cells को और फिर cell death हो सकती है. So this was the topic of classification of proteins. अगर आपके कोई query हो तो कोई भी आप लोग queries पूछ सकते हैं. You are most welcome. आप मैसेज के फॉर्म में पूछ सकते हैं, व्हाट्सएप पे पूछ सकते हैं, गूगल क्लासरूम में पूछ लें या जूम क्लास में, जिस तरह आप लोग आसान हो उस तरह पूछ सकते हैं. यहाँ पे कोई क्वेरी हो तो you are most welcome. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.